Hello, true crimerers. So, we got ourselves another TikTok video compilation video thing. This is going to be, I think it's 29 total stories, and this makes up the rest of this particular playlist that I had. It was called Cases of the Marginalized. I already put up all of my missing and murdered Indigenous women cases in a video. So this one is all the remaining videos of that playlist where there were murders or crimes committed against people of color or members of the LGBTQ plus community. This particular playlist, especially the LGBTQ plus videos on TikTok, tends to get a lot of very negative, mean-spirited comments. So these are always very difficult to post because you just didn't know what you're going to get below. So I'm going to issue the similar warning that I've given before. If you have anything mean to say, if you think any of these people deserved what they got because of who they are, what they look like, the color of their skin, you have no place here to view any videos on this channel now or in the future. So if you are that type of person, make yourself known in the comments and I can remove you permanently from seeing these videos, or you can do it yourself. But I'm more than happy to do it for you. So be on your best behavior. If you don't have anything nice to say, maybe just zip it, you know? There's no point in saying it other than to make you look like a really bad person. So, without further ado, here are, I believe, 29 stories of cases against marginalized communities. So, viewer discretion is advised.
This is the case of Jason Fox. Jason was a 19-year-old young man who grew up in Newport, Washington. Even though Jason was actually gay, he had recently come out as bisexual to the people of his town because with it being a more conservative area, he was a little afraid. He was concerned he wouldn't be accepted, so coming out as bisexual would hopefully soften the blow. On September 15th, 2020, Jason was invited to a party over at a friend's place. Jason had texted, if Riley Hillstead's going to be there, then I probably won't go, but if he's not going to be there, I'll go. He was assured that Riley Hillstead would not be there. Obviously, there was issues between the two of them. Jason was feeling nervous about this still, so he had texted a friend the address of where he was going, and then said, in case anything happens. That was the last night anyone saw Jason Fox alive. About 3 weeks later, in early October, he was found buried in a shallow grave, hands tied behind his back, and he was beaten to death. So in my first video, I told you that Jason was not going to go to the party if Riley Hillstead was going to be there. He was given assurances that Riley would not be there, but he was. In fact, it doesn't appear there was ever even a party planned. Jason's wonderful mother, Pepper Fox down there, believes that her son was lured there, and that his murder was a hate crime, simply because he was gay. Police waited until September 17th, a couple days later, to go to the address that Jason had said he was going to. Interviewed Riley Hillstead, and also Matthew Raditz Freeman, Claude Merritt, and Kevin Belding, who by the way were in their mid to late 20s. Each one of these people gave different accounts of the last time they saw Jason Fox. None of these evil pricks could get their story straight. Another man, Sean Bella, was also arrested for giving false statements. Riley Hillstead started going to these police interviews wearing bulletproof vests, pepper spray, handcuffs, again because he's a psycho. Riley told them he had just witnessed Jason Fox being beaten to death, but he took no part. He said, oh, that's all Merritt and Raditz Freeman, they did it. However, witnesses said that they saw Riley dig the hole that Jason Fox would eventually be found in. And he admitted, yep, I did dig the hole. But he said, it was just for a pipe. Claude Merritt, in his interview, said, nope, it was Riley and Raditz Freeman who beat Jason to death. And then Riley threatened him and Kevin Belding with his gun and said, if you ever say anything, I'm basically coming for you. Merritt said he also saw Raditz Freeman leading Jason Fox out of the back of the barn to the location where he was eventually beaten, and his hands were already tied behind his back. And there would be a merry-go-round of stories. So as of today, May 2nd, 2021, the 4 men I mentioned in the previous videos are all currently in jail awaiting trial. Riley Hillstead, who is basically considered the ringleader here, he was charged with first-degree murder, and if convicted, he could spend the rest of his life in prison. Goodbye. The other 3 men are also charged with his murder. I'm not 100% positive it's first-degree murder for them as well. I couldn't seem to find the charges for them. Which brings me to my next point. I would highly, highly, highly recommend you go follow Jason Fox's mom here on TikTok. Her name is Pepper Fox, but I believe her handle on here is FoxyPepper26. She gives updates all the time, and she is a badass, fierce mom who is fighting for justice, rightfully so, for her son. She's an absolute fighter, so please follow her for more up-to-date information. The way they believed that Jason was killed was his hands were tied behind his back, he was put in a shallow grave, and he was repeatedly kicked to death, which is frightening because a similar thing, minus the grave part, happened to me when I was about 16 or 17. There are too many Jason Foxes out there. Beautiful human beings being murdered because of who they naturally love, because of the color of their skin, things they can't control. We need to raise Jason Fox's voice. We can't keep reporting on stories like this. We should all be tired of it. I got lucky, I guess, but most don't. Hello, true crimerers. I wanted to give you guys an update on the Jason Fox case. One of Jason's killers, and basically the person who orchestrated his entire murder, Riley Hillstead, was just on trial. Just a quick recap, Jason Fox was a 19-year-old young man who had recently come out as being gay, living in Newport, Washington. And he was deliberately lured to a property under the guise of hanging out with friends. But the reality is they lured him there so they could kill him, because he was a gay person. They didn't just kill him, they brutalized him. They tore him to pieces, then buried him in a shallow grave. His killers were caught, and one by one they've been going on trial. And just the other day, the main one, Riley Hillstead, was found guilty of second-degree murder. He was also found guilty of unauthorized removal or concealment of a body, tampering with evidence, unlawful disposal of human remains, and tampering with evidence in relation to the death of Jason Fox. This is a win for Jason. This is a win for his wonderful mother, Pepper. And this victory for Jason is also a huge victory for people in the LGBTQ community. You know, you don't just get to go around and kill us because you don't agree with who we were born as or who we are today. You don't get to torture us because you think being gay is icky. It's a victory for the LGBTQ, me, Jason, because we get to feel like we're humans. We matter. If we're murdered just because we're gay, we get our justice still. We just want to live. We want to exist. We want to be loved. We want to not be afraid that we're going to get hunted by people. Like here in Arizona, there's a guy going around saying he's hunting gay people. Imagine wanting to kill someone or hunt someone because of something that doesn't even affect you or enter your life or anything. Imagine wanting to kill someone because you're insecure about yourself. Maybe it helps you, be a man. And I'm rambling. Jason Fox is this generation's Matthew Shepard. His story should be taught to every generation from this point moving forward. We know about Matthew Shepard. We know about Brandon Teena. We should all always know about Jason Fox as well. And I am just so happy for him today. In honor of Pride Month and Jason Fox, we continue to tell stories about crimes committed against the LGBTQ+ community. Matthew Shepard was born on December 1st, 1976, in Casper, Wyoming. By the mid-90s, he was a political science major at the University of Wyoming in Laramie. In 1995, Matthew was on a school trip to Morocco, where unfortunately he had been beaten and sexually assaulted. This led to extreme anxiety, major depression, suicidal thoughts. Friends of his said that they were worried that Matthew had turned to drugs to sort of cope with all of this. And he was eventually hospitalized a few times for depression and for thoughts of ending his own life. By the way, just so you are aware, yes, Matthew Shepard was gay, and he was also positive for HIV. On the night of October 6, 1998, Matthew Shepard was out at the Fireside Lounge in Laramie. While he was at the bar, he would be approached by Aaron McKinney and Russell Henderson. These two men plus Matthew were all in their very early 20s. They told Matthew Shepard that they would gladly give him a ride home. They were also accompanied by their girlfriends, Chastity Palsy and Kristen Price. Well, they didn't drive Matthew Shepard home. They instead drove Matthew to a remote area where they proceeded to tie him to a barbed wire fence that is in this location where this is now, where they pistol whipped him, crushed his skull, and tortured him. And then they left Matthew Shepard here to die. They said Matthew Shepard's face was beaten so badly that it was covered in blood, and the only parts that you could see his normal skin was where his tears had fell. The girlfriends of the two assailants would go on to say that neither of their boyfriends were under the influence of any kind of drugs or alcohol. The two assailants would go on to say that they obtained Matthew Shepard's address and intended to break into his home and rob his stuff there. You know, while Matthew Shepard was dying in freezing cold temperatures. These two men picked a fight with two other men later on. The cops were called. The cops then searched their vehicle, and they found the blood-soaked gun, along with Matthew Shepard's shoes and his credit card. Real smart. They tried to convince their girlfriends to give them alibis by lying, but they didn't do it. Matthew Shepard was in a coma tied to this fence for 18 hours before anyone found him. A bicyclist named Aaron Kreifels found him, and he originally thought he was a scarecrow. Matthew had fractures to the back of his skull. He had severe brainstem damage, which means his body couldn't regulate body heat, heart rate, his vital functions, and he would die 6 days later. They would be charged with attempted murder, kidnapping, and robbery, but that would later be changed to first-degree murder. The two girls pled guilty to accessories after the fact and got lesser sentences. Both men were sentenced to 2 life sentences without possibilities of parole. So during the initial investigation against the two men who did this to him, one of the detectives spoke to one of the girlfriends, Kristen Price, who I believe is this one. She said that her boyfriend told her, and her boyfriend was McKinney, that the violence committed against Matthew Shepard was, quote, triggered by how he felt about the gay community. At one of the men's sentencing hearings, his lawyer would go on to say that no, this had nothing to do with the fact that Matthew Shepard was gay. But Matthew Shepard was actually lured out of the bar by one of these two men, and one of them was pretending to be a gay man. So clearly this indicates some sort of premeditation, and they used his homosexuality as a weapon. McKinney, his lawyer, would try and fail to use the gay panic defense, saying that he was triggered to temporary insanity fueled by sexual advances from Matthew Shepard, because allegedly Matthew had put his hand on his kneecap. Oh no. But the judge was like, get the fuck out of here. No, we're not accepting that. However, the jury was not settled on the fact that this was premeditated murder, so they convicted him of felony murder, which could have gotten him the death sentence. But thanks to Matthew Shepard's parents, they brokered a deal that would allow McKinney to be incarcerated for 2 life sentences without the possibility of parole, instead of giving him the death sentence. Trigger warning, I'm about to show someone holding a sign with a very negative word on it. The horrific monsters known as the Westboro Baptist Church, who I did a video on them over on the Atheist Agnostic Hype House page. That was part of my Evil Churches series. I really need to go back to that page, I think. But they protested at Matthew Shepard's funeral with their wonderful signs that say, God hates fags. They also had signs that said, Matt's in hell. But Matthew Shepard's town had his back, saying Matthew Shepard was killed by homophobes. Good on them. In 1998, Matthew Shepard's parents would go on to start the Matthew Shepard Foundation for LGBTQ rights, especially for gay youths. After many, many years of trying and never getting full support from both sides of the aisle, And yes, both sides, Democrats and Republicans, both had members of their parties vote against this particular act, over the years, from Bill Clinton to George Bush to now to Barack Obama, who in 2009, with Judy Shepard by his side and the mother of James Byrd Jr., they signed into law the Matthew Shepard and James Hate Crimes Prevention Act, which finally included language referring to sexual orientation and gender identity, so his legacy lives on forever. It would start with the brutal murder of a young man, and then it would end with his mother taking the Klan head on. Hello, true crimerers. This is the case of Michael Donald. Viewer discretion is advised. Michael was born on July 24th, 1961 in Mobile, Alabama. He was the baby of 6 kids. He grew up in a very loving household led by his mother, Beulah. By 1981, he was studying at a technical college. In 1981, there was a black man by the name of Josephus Anderson on trial for killing a white cop. Now, this case went through numerous mistrials, and that really pissed off a certain group. A chapter of the, let's call it the Triple K, just in case, called the UKA, or the United Klans of America, they were angry that this African-American man still hadn't been convicted. So this fella, Benny Jack Hayes, well, he stated something publicly. He said, and I quote, "If a black man can get away with killing a white man, we ought to be able to get away with killing a black man." So he would have a little powwow with some people. He would enlist the help of his son, 26-year-old Henry Hayes, and another member of their little chapter, 17-year-old James Tiger Knowles. Do white supremacists just age really poorly? Yeah, they do. Well, the plan was to drive around Mobile and just find the very first black person they could and kill them. 19-year-old Michael Donald had just gone to a local convenience store to buy a pack of cigarettes for his sister. He had zero connection to the whole trial that was going on. He has zero connection to do with the Hayes family. But he was in the wrong place at the wrong time, because Tiger King wannabe up here and his buddy Henry were driving around in their truck with a noose. They came up to Michael Donald, pulled up next to him and said, "Hey, can you give us directions somewhere?" He said, "Sure." But then they took out guns and they forced him inside the truck. They would then drive Michael Donald to a secluded location where they tied the noose around his neck, beat him, and then tightened the rope for several minutes until he choked to death. And then they slit his throat multiple times to make sure he was dead. And then they found a tree in the neighborhood Michael lived in, strung him up to it, and hung him from it. It took some time and some persuading from Michael's mother, Beulah, to get this case solved, which they eventually did. Henry Hayes was found guilty and sentenced to death. He was executed. Tiger was convicted and sentenced to life in prison. He testified against Henry, so Mama wasn't done. No. She filed a civil suit against the United Klans of America. And guess what? She won. She would be awarded $7 million. The UKA, they had to close. They went bankrupt. A black woman took down the Klan. Mwah! Hello, true crimerers. For Pride Month, it's time for another LGBTQ plus case. I am not doing these as frequently as I wanted to because the comments are horrendous. But this is the case of the New York City Ramrod shooting. Viewer discretion is advised. The Ramrod bar, oh my god, that's just very difficult to say seriously. It was located on Christopher Street, and this was in Greenwich Village in New York City. It was a very happening gay bar, usually always had a big crowd, and by all accounts from what I've read about it, it was just a really happening place. It was just like a whole vibe. Just a place where people could be who they truly were. Especially during a time when, unfortunately, being who you were wasn't looked at as favorably as it may be today. Pictured here was 38-year-old Ronald Crumpley. He had used to be a transit police officer, and he was actually the son of a minister. On November 19th, 1980, he actually stole his dad's vehicle and began to cruise the streets. In the car with him were 4 guns: a .357 Magnum, a .45 caliber pistol, a 9mm automatic pistol, and an Uzi. Ronald had an opinion on the gay community. He said, and I quote, I want to kill them all. They're no good. They ruin everything. End quote. First, he drove up to Sim's Deli and he fired shots into it. And he did hit a couple people, but no one died. And then that is when he drove his car to Christopher Street, where the Ramrod Bar and another bar called Sneakers, and this is Sneakers here, they were essentially just right down the sidewalk from one another. So Ronald would get out of his car and he would sort of just linger around, kind of going back and forth between both bars for a couple of minutes. He then walked around the back of the building and then walked back to the front, took out one of his guns and saw a man waiting outside of Ramrod, a man just waiting for a cab to go home, took out his gun and shot the man, and he fell over. Another gentleman began to run around the building, and Ronald caught up to him and fired a couple rounds into him, and that man fell to the ground. He then took out his Uzi and began spraying the front of both bars, hitting several more people. When it was all said and done, 2 men died. I guess in a weird way we can be thankful because it could have been a lot more. This was Vernon Koenig. He worked at a nearby church, and another man named Jorg Wenz was shot and killed. The story barely got any press. He was found not guilty by reason of insanity, but spent the rest of his life in a mental institution. Hello, true crimeers. Isn't this pretty? Anyway, it is Pride Month, so we are going to tell another story of a member of the LGBTQ who was murdered just for being who they were. And this is the case of Richie Phillips. Viewer discretion is advised. And to those who are going to ask in the comments, yes, I am gay. And if you have nothing nice to say, please don't say it in the comments, even though you're going to anyway. Richie was a 36-year-old gay man who lived in Elizabethtown, Kentucky. Sadly, I cannot find any personal information about him. Even his obituary online is blank. But on the afternoon of June 17th, 2003, he was of Amadou Diallo. Amadou was born on September 2nd, 1975, in Sano County, Liberia. I'm sorry if I mispronounced that. When Amadou was about 21 years old, he followed some family members and moved to New York City. And he started a business with his cousin. During the day, he made ends meet by selling video cassettes, gloves, socks on the street. The final thing his mother would ever hear him say is, "Mom, I'm going to college," on a voicemail he left her. In the very early morning hours of February 4th, 1999, Amadou was standing outside of his apartment after eating a meal. At around 12:40 in the morning, 4 plainclothes officers, Edward McMillan, Sean Carroll, Kenneth Boss, and Richard Murphy, they were searching for a serial sexual assaulter in the Sound View section of the Bronx. These 4 officers in an unmarked vehicle were driving down Wheeler Avenue. They saw Amadou Diallo standing outside the apartment, and so they interrogated him. They ordered Diallo to show his hands, where at this point it's claimed that he had ran into the little apartment entrance. He reached into his pocket to grab his wallet when these 4 plainclothes officers then fired 41 shots using semi-automatic pistols. They fatally struck Diallo 19 times. This is where all of the shell casings and whatnot were found. Now, that little section that Amadou had ran back into, this little area, he literally had nowhere to go. There was nowhere to hide. Once the shots were fired, he was dead. Several eyewitnesses said the officers continued to shoot even though Amadou Diallo was already on the ground dead. The investigation that took place found 0 weapons on Amadou Diallo, and all he had was the wallet. The NYPD did their own internal investigation into the officers, and they found that they were within their rights to do what they did, saying any reasonable police officer would do it. On March 25th, 1999, a grand jury in the Bronx would indict all 4 police officers with second-degree murder and reckless endangerment. They had to do a change of venue to Albany, New York, given the insane publicity of the case. But on February 25th, 2000, a jury of 4 black jurors and 8 white jurors found them to be not guilty. In April of 2000, Amadou's parents filed a $61 million lawsuit against the city and the officers, and in 2004 they accepted a $3 million settlement, the largest ever of its kind at the time. Those officers' crime unit was disbanded, but we are still here today. This was Private First Class Barry Winchell. He was born on August 31st, 1977. He lived in Missouri his entire life until he enlisted in the Army in 1997. And by 1998, he was transferred to Fort Campbell in Kentucky as a private first class. And there he was assigned to the 2nd Battalion, 502nd Infantry of the 101st Airborne Division. One night while in Nashville, Barry and some of his fellow soldiers, including his roommate, Specialist Justin Fisher, they went out and partied and got drunk and went to a club. Now, this club would feature transgender performers, one of them being Calpurnia Adams. And Barry and Calpurnia met there. They hit it off right away, and then they began to date. Fisher began to spread rumors around the base, some of the stuff referring to Barry as, a homosexual. He's dating a man, mocking the transgender woman he was dating. And all of this led to nothing but harassment and bigotry. And their superiors did nothing to stop it. On the 4th of July, 1999, Winchell would get into a fight with another soldier. His name is Calvin Glover. Winchell had accused him of being a fraud. They were both shit-faced drunk, but they actually fought, like fist fought. And Winchell kicked his ass. Well, Fisher here then began to make fun of Glover, saying that he just got beaten by and trigger warning, but I'm gonna say the actual words here, that he was beaten by a fucking faggot. That did not sit so well with Mr. Glover. He went over to Fisher's locker, he grabbed a baseball bat, and as Winchell was asleep in his cot, he bashed his head in with the bat. Winchell would be pronounced dead on July 6 from extreme head trauma. Due to his involvement in this murder, Fisher took a plea bargain and was sentenced to 12.5 years in prison and was denied clemency in 2003. 2006, he was released into a halfway house, and later that year was fully released from all custody. Glover was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. All of this because Winchell was dating a transgender woman. Fort Winchell, where all these three men were stationed, had a very high anti-gay, tone. The climate was really negative towards the gay community. Now, this is also in the middle of Don't Ask, Don't Tell, where you're not allowed to be openly gay and serve in the military. So this story started a whole kerfuffle, but ultimately nothing came from it. I mean, Don't Ask, Don't Tell was finally repealed, several years ago, but it did nothing to help Barry Winchell. And he wasn't even gay. He was just dating a transgender woman. The story was turned into a 2003 TV movie called Soldier's Girl. It was critically acclaimed and received several awards. But it's too bad he had to die for that story to be told. This was 17-year-old Gwen Araujo. At the time of this case, she was living in Newark, California. Gwen was born on February 24th, 1985, and she was born as a biological male, who was named Edward Araujo Jr. In 1999, by age 14, she came out as a transgender. And this is when she began using the name Gwen because her favorite musician at the time was Gwen Stefani. But she would also sometimes go by the names Wendy or Lita. She first started by growing her hair out long, and there was plans to eventually do the hormone treatment, and eventually the surgery. And of course, because of all of this, because kids can be little assholes, she was bullied for this in school. Around August or September of 2002, Gwen would meet a few men: Michael Magdison, Jose Morel, Geron Nabors, and Jason Cazares. I don't know if I said their names right, and honestly I don't care because they're scum. Spoiler alert, here's them in court. Sometime after all of them met, a few of these guys would question each other, hey, is she a dude? What's going on with her? But I guess they never, moved forward with their thinking. Some of these men would engage in oral sex with Gwen and other forms of sex. She would typically push the men's hands away from her nether regions so that they couldn't feel what she had. On the night of October 3rd, 2002, she would attend a party that was hosted by Jose and Paul. But the other two men of that foursome were also there, as well as a whole bunch of other people. Allegedly at the party, someone would hear Jose Morel say, "I swear if it's a fucking man, I'm going to kill him. If it's a man, she ain't gonna leave." And apparently Geron Nabors said, "Whatever you do, just don't make a mess." At the party, several of these men would try to force her to go to the bathroom to reveal her gender, or for them to feel down below so they can see what gender she was. And at one point in the evening, it was revealed that she was a male. When they yelled out, "It's a fucking man." And all four of the, initial men she met months ago became super pissed because she had sexual relations with all of them at some point. Jose Morel would vomit and cry, screaming, "I can't fucking be gay." Michael Magnuson would then punch her in the face, throwing her to the ground. And then he put her in a chokehold. Gwen was begging for her life, saying she has a family. Jose Morel then struck her in the head with a can of food, and then he struck her with a frying pan. They would continue to assault her throughout the evening. Magnuson would then strangle her with a rope while Cazares hit her with a shovel. After she was dead, they buried her near the Sierra Nevada mountains in a 3-foot grave with boulders on her body. So, not one single person at this party reported the crime. Gwen was reported missing by her mother on October 5th, 2002. Allegedly, police did not take this missing persons report very seriously because she was transgender and she had a history of staying places overnight. But it wouldn't take long for Gwen's mother to hear rumors about what might have happened to her. She heard a story about how a transgender girl was outed at a party and was murdered and buried in Tahoe. So by October 9th, the family told the police, and the police began to interview everyone from the party. Turns out Jerome Nabors, however the fuck you say his name, confessed to a friend what they did. The friend told the police had him wear a wire, and then Jerome Nabors was caught. On October 15th, Jerome Nabors led the police to Gwen's body. On February 24th, 2003, Nabors would plead guilty to voluntary manslaughter, and he agreed to testify against the other defendants, and he was sentenced to 11 years in prison. With time served, he was expected to only serve 6 years in prison. The trials of Jason Cazares, Michael Magnuson, and Jose Morel, well, the first trial ended in a mistrial after 9 days of posthumously changed her legal name to Gwen Amber Rose Araujo. The Horizons Foundation would then also set up a fund for transgender youth and education called the Gwen Araujo Memorial Fund for Transgender Education. Gwen's mother limit the use of gay panic defense. A woman would be murdered in a sundown town simply because the color of her skin. Hello, true crimeers. This is the case of Carol Jenkins. Viewer discretion is advised. Carol was born on October 19th, 1947 in Indiana. Later in life, Carol had aspirations to move to Chicago and become a model, and she probably could have because she was beautiful. But until that time would come, she would get kind of odd jobs here and there, and at the time of the story, she was working for an encyclopedia company. She would go door to door around neighborhoods selling the Collier's encyclopedia sets. On September 16th, 1968, that's exactly what she was doing. Her and 3 co-workers would go to a neighborhood in Indiana to, go door to door. She was with 2 white co-workers and 1 other black female. Now, this neighborhood in Martinsville, Indiana, was called a sundown town, which was a town where they only permitted white people. And these towns were basically like a town that practiced segregation, and they would usually have a lot of discriminatory laws against black Americans. But Carol said, damned it all to hell, I'm going to go there anyway because it's my job. And she did it. At one point, she was walking around the neighborhood on her own, and she noticed that there was a car kind of slowly following her. Carol would come across the home of Don and Carol Neal, and she knocked on their door because she was a little afraid of the people driving next to her. And they actually let her in the home, and they called the police for Carol. And police came, and they said they found the guy driving around, and he won't be a problem anymore. So Carol felt it was safe to leave their house, and Norma would walk around the neighborhood with her until she found her coworkers. When they couldn't find the coworkers, Norma and Dawn said, hey, just stay at her house and we can figure this out. But Carol said, no, I need to leave. She walked out of their house at 8:30 p.m. About 20 minutes later, 2 men in a car jumped out of their car and began to chase her down. One of them took out a screwdriver and stabbed her directly in the heart. And this was while the other man held her arms back,
preventing her from defending herself. Carol would fall into some bushes and she died right there on the street. Police, of course, seemed to be pretty indifferent towards it. They were like, Carol's parents were adamant that the FBI get involved due to the racial sensitivity of this. Police said, nah. And then nothing happened. They didn't really investigate this at all. A black woman murdered in a sundown town. To them, it was just, I don't know. Her family would get answers in June of 2000. In June of 2000, Carol's mother would receive an anonymous phone call where the person on the other line said who killed Carol. So her mother, Elizabeth, they would hire a private investigator to look into this person that was named. The Indiana State Police, now that times have drastically changed, they decided to reopen this cold case that really never seemed to be realized was a cold case. I think it was just sort of tucked away that no one could ever see it. And then those detectives would receive an anonymous letter a year later. The letter stated that Carol Jenkins' killer was this man, Kenneth Clay Richmond. The letter came from his daughter. Her name was Shirley. She was there that day. She witnessed her father murder Carol Jenkins. She was 7 years old. This is what he would have looked like in 1985, but this is what the decrepit old shit looked like in 2002 when he was finally arrested for the murder of Carol Jenkins. Surprise, surprise, back in 1968, he was a member of the, let's call it the Triple K. And he was also a career criminal, just breaking the law anytime he could. And that night when Carol was killed, he was just passing through town. He didn't even live there. So his daughter Shirley would come face to face with police, and she would break down the whole thing. Shirley, at the age of 7, was tucked down in the back seat of the car. Her father and another man who she didn't know who it was and still doesn't, they were out drinking and getting shit-faced, and then they started driving around town with, the 7-year-old girl in the back. She then witnessed as they stalked her and then stabbed her to death, left her to die, laughed about it. When they got back in the car, they said she got what she deserved. Shirley was given $7 by her father for each year she was alive. It was hush money. $7. I mean, she was 7. She didn't understand what was going on, and she was way too afraid to say anything. Kenneth Richmond would never go to trial because he was declared incompetent in 2002. 2 weeks after that, though, he died of bladder cancer. Ah, raspberries. Oh, by the way, Dawn and Norma Neal, who helped Carol that day, they received threats, death threats, violent threats against them because they helped Carol that day. But these two wonderful people are still very happy that they gave her some sort of protection. His unknown accomplice is still unknown, and hopefully he's just dead too. America. Not only did they die excruciating deaths, but afterwards, they would be forgotten. Hello, true crimerers. This is another Pride Month case, and it is the case of the Upstairs Lounge arson. Viewer discretion is advised. The Upstairs Lounge bar was a gay bar in New Orleans, Louisiana, and it was on the second floor of this building. It was always a very happening place, somewhere where members of the LGBTQ could go to just be themselves, not have to worry about anyone or anything judging them or telling them they're gonna go to hell. It was just a very positive environment. But sadly, one night that would all change. On the evening of June 24th, 1973, at approximately 7:50 p.m., someone would light a small fire in a staircase. It was essentially the entryway to the bar. Someone opens the door, and then a massive backdraft occurs. The fire essentially rushes into the building, and within minutes, the bar is just in flames. One of the bar's managers said he thought he smelled the smell of gasoline, or possibly lighter fluid. Right as the fire started, one of the workers at the bar
grabbed about 25 of the patrons inside, brought them to the roof because there was access to get to the other building's roof, and then they could get out that way, because essentially the stairway out of the building is on fire. Inside the bar that evening was this gentleman, Reverend Bill Larson. He was a pastor at the Metropolitan Community Church, which was a pro-LGBTQ church. He managed to remove a giant air conditioning system from one of the windows. This allowed for a few more people to get out. But sadly, as he was trying to get out, the window pane slid down on top of him, and it pinned him in, and he would end up burning to death. Another pastor, George Mitchell, he had gone back in to save his partner, but unfortunately in that process, they both would end up dying. In the end, the fire lasted 16 minutes, and 32 people lost their lives. The majority of them members of the LGBTQ. No one was ever arrested or charged with the arson. Police really didn't bother investigating anything. The community, they were indifferent. They didn't have any, days of mourning for the victims. Not one politician said a single thing about it. Churches in the area refused to bury the dead because of their LGBTQ status. One loving pastor did hold services, and he was reprimanded for doing so. And to this day, the upstairs lounge arson is nothing but a faint memory. Hello, true crimerers. It is June, which means it is now officially Pride Month. So, like I did last year throughout June, I will be telling the stories of the LGBTQ who have been murdered simply because they were who they were. And yes, I am a part of the LGBTQ. If you don't like it, you can leave. This is the case of Paul Broussard. Viewer discretion is advised. Paul was a 27-year-old banker who just had a zest for life. He was a highly intelligent individual, and he just loved to make jokes with his friends. Yeah, gays like us, we got good senses of humor. And yes, Paul was a gay man. On July 4th, 1991, here in the Montrose neighborhood of Houston, Texas, Paul and a couple of his friends were hanging out at the Heaven nightclub. Sometime between 2 a.m. and 3 a.m., they left the bar, and their plan was just to go home for the rest of the evening. They just lived a couple of blocks down the road. This is when 10 young men approached the trio of friends and asked them for directions. Paul, being the helpful person he is, gave them directions to where they wanted to go. But then suddenly, they exited their vehicles and began to chase the trio of gay men. The three of them ran, and Paul's two friends managed to get away, but Paul, unfortunately, did not. This group of young men went out that evening with the intent of finding gay men to harass them, possibly even physically assault them. Paul would run over here to this parking lot, and this gate wasn't there at the time, but was more open. But then the group of men cornered him right over here, and they just beat the living shit out of Paul. They just beat him to a bloody pulp. Again, because he was a gay man. The main shitface in charge was this guy, John Boyce. He then took out a pocket knife and stabbed Paul in the abdomen. Paul had abrasions over his entire body, multiple puncture wounds, a broken rib, his testicles were severely damaged, and he had 2 stab wounds which would prove to be fatal. He would die in the hospital just a few hours later. Police? They couldn't be bothered. They didn't want to investigate this, which is just so blatantly fucked up, Like, why? Why? Thank goodness for this man, activist Ray Hill. He would lead protests throughout Houston. People would show up in groves in support of this endeavor to get police to find and arrest who murdered Paul Broussard. An organization called Queer Nation, they then made this an even bigger protest. And thankfully, their efforts, it worked. The young men who did this, of course, they had to brag because that's what they do. One of the girlfriends of one of the assailants went to police after she found out that they were involved in Paul Broussard's murder. Eventually, all 10 men would be arrested. Paul Boyce, he would end up turning himself in. The media would call this group of 10 boys the Woodlands 10, because I guess they came from an area known as the Woodlands.
All 10 men would end up taking plea deals, so none of them actually went to trial. 5 of the young men would end up taking probation deals, which means they did not go to prison. One of the men, Chance Dillon, he got a 20-year sentence for attempted murder since he was not the one to give the fatal blow. 3 other men ended up getting 15-year sentences apiece, and Paul Boyce, he got 45 years. Chance Dillon was released in 2000 on parole. John Boyce, he was denied parole at least 3 times in 2003, 2005, 2007. He was then granted parole in 2011, but then the courts revoked it, and that was for reasons not released to the public. But then in November of 2015, he was officially paroled. Apparently, he wrote a letter to the gay community apologizing for his actions. Whatever. In January 2020, he was once again arrested because of a DWI. He was drunk and he drove his car into a ditch. I don't know the outcome of that situation, though. Meanwhile, Paul Broussard is still dead. He's dead because he came out of a gay bar, because he's a gay man. Paul Broussard was not the first. No, not by any means. He certainly was not the last. It's 2022, and shit like this still happens. Being gay is, sometimes it's not great. Aaron Salter, Ruth Whitfield, Pearlie Young, Catherine Massey, Deacon Hayward Patterson, Celestine Cheney, Roberta Drury, Margus Morrison, Andre McNeil, and Geraldine Talley. I will not be saying his name. What's the story, Mike? You know the story. Just another day in the land of the free and home of the brave. Just another day. This long and windy road would be absolute hell and torture for a man in Texas. Hello, true crimerers. This is the case of James Byrd Jr. Viewer discretion is advised. James here was born on May 2nd, 1949 in Jasper, Texas. He grew up in a religious home. His father was actually a deacon. His mother taught Sunday school. He graduated from a segregated high school. He would then go on to get married and had 3 wonderful children. On June 7th, 1998, James Byrd would get a ride home from someone he thought was a friend, 23-year-old Sean Berry. Also in the truck with him that night was 23-year-old John William King. 23, really? Must be from later down in life. And 31-year-old Lawrence Brewer. James Byrd was just looking for a ride home. He would never get there. He would never get to see his wife or his 3 kids again. Because those 3 men, they were white supremacists. In this truck, they took him to a dark and desolate part of town where they would spray paint his face, they would urinate on him, they would defecate on him, and beat the living crap out of him. They would use this exact chain to then tie him to the back of the pickup truck by his ankles. And then they dragged him for 3 miles across asphalt road and gravel. James Byrd would die roughly halfway through this trip when they turned a corner sharply and he smashed into that culvert right there where his right arm and his head were severed off. The 3 men then took what was left of his body and dumped it at the foot of an African-American church. His head would be found the following morning. In fact, there were 81 different locations where they found some parts of James Byrd. The autopsy showed that he also had every single rib fractured, and he was likely alive up until the very point where he was decapitated. Along the path, they found several pieces of evidence that connected them to these 3 pieces of garbage. They were questioned and then arrested. Their bodies were littered with white supremacist tattoos, racist remarks tattooed on them. King even had a tattoo of a black man being hung. The men smiled their way through all of the court proceedings. They were even proud of what they did. King would say, regardless of the outcome, we have made history. Sieg Heil.
Yeah, well, you can go fuck yourselves. Sean Barry got life in prison, with parole possible at 63 years. King and Brewer, they got the death sentence, and both men have been executed. Oh well, they dedicated a park to James, and his story would change Texas laws. He would proudly serve our country, but because of who he was born to be, he had to die. Hello, true crimerers. This is another LGBTQ plus case. Viewer discretion is strongly advised for this one. This handsome man was 22-year-old Alan Schindler Jr. He grew up in Chicago Heights, Illinois, and his entire family essentially was a military family. Alan was a radio man, a petty officer 3rd class serving in the Navy. Alan was also a proud gay man. And this story takes place in 1992. A few months later, the Clinton administration would enact the controversial don't ask, don't tell policy in the military. And Alan's story would play heavily into that. Alan was being harassed, mainly due to his sexual orientation. Trigger warning for something I'm about to say. I want to be respectful, but I also want you guys to feel the weight of this story. One of his shipmates would say to him, "There's a faggot on this ship, and he's got to die." They would do silly things like glue his locker shut. They would push him around, shove him. Alan no longer felt safe. He told his chain of command, Captain Douglas J. Brad. They didn't really want to do anything about it. So Alan began his process of separating from the Navy. But the higher-up said, "Can you please stay on the ship while the separation is still in process?" And even though Alan knew he was at risk of getting injured, he stayed. The USS Below Wood, it would dock in Sasebo, Nagasaki, Japan. And of course, most of the shipmates would leave and go exploring. This is Airman Apprentice Terry Helvey. He worked in the weather department on the ship. One night he followed Alan Schindler Jr. to a public restroom, where he brutally attacked and killed him. Alan had 4 fatal injuries to the chest, the abdomen, and the head. His head was actually crushed where you couldn't even recognize him. All of his ribs were broken, and his genitals were cut. He was kicked so hard that he had the actual shoe impressions embedded into his face and chest. This man, Charles Vins, was there. He witnessed the murder and he did nothing about it. Terry would be arrested and he would claim it had nothing to do with the fact that he was gay. But then several witnesses would say he did say that he hates homosexuals, he's disgusted by them, he didn't regret killing him and he would do it again. He got life without parole. He got 78 days. He hid evidence, and he was demoted. Will it ever stop?
Hello, true crimerer peoples. I am here to tell story, yes? Please, stop accent. Okay.
This is the case of Jacob B. Robida. Jacob here was born on June 13th, 1987, and he was from New Bedford, Massachusetts, and he was a neo-Nazi. On February 2nd, 2006, Jacob would enter a gay bar named Puzzles Lounge, and this bar is located in New Bedford, Massachusetts. Jacob was 18 years old. He dressed head to toe in black. Gee, that's original, Jake. He whipped out a fake ID, purchased a drink, chugged it, and then he asked the bartender, "Hey, is this a gay bar?" The bartender said, "Yeah, it is." Jacob ordered a second drink, then pulled out a hatchet and just swung it at the nearest patron's head. Luckily, the man did not die, but he did get very injured. The people in the bar came like crazy, tackled Jacob, good on them. He then pulls out a gun, and he just started blindly shooting, just wherever he could. Thankfully, Jacob is just as bad as a shot as he is a hatchet wielder, because no one died in the bar. But he did manage to wound 3 additional people, along with the man that he hit with the hatchet. This is one of his victims from the bar. He was shot in the small of the back. Jacob then hopped in his sexy 1999 green Pontiac Grand Am, and well, he fled. like a coward. Police would say, yep, this is a hate crime. And once they would catch him, they would charge him with at least 3 counts of attempted murder. Jacob managed to drive to Charleston, West Virginia, where he picked up his ex-girlfriend, Jennifer Rena Bailey, and they drove away somewhere. They used to live together, but then they since were separated. Jennifer had a young child. There's no indication if she was forced in the vehicle or if she went willingly, but she would not come out of it alive. So then a manhunt began. They searched the home he lived in with his mother. He had Nazi regalia everywhere in his room. He wrote anti-Semitic crap all over his walls. February 4th, 2006, 2 days after the incident, he was spotted in Arcana, Arkansas. Police found him, and then a shootout occurred. His car would spin out of control and he crashed. There was then a back and forth shooting between him and the cops, where then he just randomly shot Jennifer point blank in the head and killed her. He also shot and killed Officer Jim Sell before turning the gun on himself. This is the story of the first time in Alabama that a white man was convicted of murdering a black man. Hello, true crimerers. This is the case of Willie Brewster. Viewer discretion is advised. In July of 1965, Willie Brewster was working at the Union Foundry, and he typically worked the night shifts. On July 15th, 1965, he left work with a coworker, and the coworker was driving him home. They were on Highway 202 when all of a sudden gunshots rang out. Willie was shot in the neck. He was brought to a hospital in Anniston, Alabama, where 2 days later he would die. Now, just a little bit before the shooting occurred, there was a national states' rights party that was being hosted by white extremists. Attending that gathering was this man, Hubert Damon Strange. Yeah, that about checks out. You see, at this national state rights party, apparently the speakers were encouraging their fellow filth to go around and shoot or kill black people, to just commit violent acts against them, for fun. So when Willie Brewster was shot, no one came forward, of course, until the paper put out an ad offering a $20,000 reward for the arrest, the capture, the conviction of whoever killed Willie Brewster. And that reward was endorsed by about 270 black and white people in the area. And this led to the arrest of Hubert. By December 1965, he was put on trial. He had a jury of 12 white people, and after just 7 hours of deliberation, he was convicted. And it marked the very first time in Alabama's history that a white man was convicted for the murder of a black man. But it wasn't all victory, because he was only sentenced to 10 years for murder, yeah. But he never served any jail time. Do you want to know why? In 1967, while he was appealing his sentence, which he would end up losing, he was killed himself in a fight. Aw, raspberries. And then the city of Anniston dedicated this plaque remembering Willie Brewster. At least he got his justice. Hello, true crimerers. This is another LGBTQ case. Viewer discretion is advised. And this is the case of Arthur J.R. Warren of Granttown, West Virginia. Arthur was considered this quiet guy. He didn't really ruffle any feathers. He sort of kept to himself. He unfortunately was born with learning disabilities. He also had a birth defect where he was born without several fingers on his hands. When he was 16 years old, he came out to both his mother and his pastor. And in kind of an unusual turn of events, they both accepted it. On July 3rd, 2000, and at this point Arthur is 26 years old, Arthur would leave his home and meet some friends for some kind of pre-4th of July fireworks. He left his home sometime around 11 to 11:30, and his mom said, please be home by 12:30. And by the way, sorry, there aren't really many pictures of him I can find, so... But he did not return home at 12:30 or 1:30, and then by 2:30 in the morning, his mom just assumed he went to stay the night at a friend's house. So it turns out he was not actually meeting friends to go watch fireworks. He was actually meeting a 17-year-old friend of his, David Parker. And again, this is the only picture of him I could find. And spoiler alert, So David Parker was painting a house that his family had purchased. The house was empty, and he invited Arthur over. And his 17-year-old cousin, Jared Wilson, picture I cannot find, and a 15-year-old friend of theirs, Joel Schumacher, again, sorry, no picture, they also were at the house. They got drunk, a little bit. They also huffed gasoline fumes. Oh, always a good time. Arthur also allegedly brought Xanax, because he requested it, which they crushed those up and snorted them. I didn't even know you could do that. Well, apparently an argument broke out. You see, allegedly, David Parker got pissed because he said that Arthur was spreading rumors around that the two of them had sexual relations. Arthur said, "No, I didn't do that." According to some sources, there was an actual physical relationship between the two. Well, at some point, David Parker and Jared Wilson, they just began beating up Arthur Warren. They kicked him and hit him with steel-toed boots. Schumacher did not participate, allegedly. They put Arthur in the car. They then went to a desolate location, put Arthur in the middle of the road, and ran him over 4 times, killing him. His body was discovered a couple of hours later. Schumacher went to police and confessed to what the boys did. Parker got 15 years to life. Jared Wilson got 20 years. Schumacher was not sentenced.
Hello, true crimerers. This is the LGBTQ plus case of Lawrence King. On February 12, 2008, Lawrence would be shot dead. How did we get there? Larry, as he was also known, was born on January 13th, 1993. He would be born to a 15-year-old crack-addicted alcoholic mother, and the biological father had already abandoned them. His mother didn't have any money or proper work, so she began working as a prostitute to make money to support him and her drug habit. A few years later, he would be adopted along with his newborn baby brother to Gregory and Dawn King in Oxnard, California. By the time he hit 3rd grade, Larry was getting bullied frequently at school. This was because he had an effeminate personality and he came out as gay happily and proudly when he was 10 years old. But the bullying didn't seem to deflate his confidence, because by the time he started attending E.O. Green Jr. High School, Larry would actually go to school dressed sometimes in girls' clothing, jewelry, makeup, high heels, and again, he did so proudly. He would also befriend a group of girls, as us gay guys tend to do. Faculty would grow concerned, saying that his dress and appearance may be a distraction to students, but because of California's anti-discriminatory laws, the school was not allowed to tell Larry that he wasn't allowed to dress the way he dressed. They would just tell the other faculty members, please give him his space, this is his choice, and offer the support he needs. This is where things become kind of complicated. This was one of Larry's fellow classmates at junior high. His name was Brandon McInerney. He was one of the kids who bullied Larry kind of all the time, calling him gay slurs, making fun of the way he dressed, yada yada yada, the same old, same old. Well, Larry decided to react to his bullying in a way that I've heard of other gay men doing, but not frequently. Larry would start flirting with Brandon. He shot gazes at him. He made passes at him. One day, Larry asked Brandon to be his Valentine and said, "I love you, baby," to him. This caused Brandon himself to get bullied by his friends. Essentially, what would come up in court was that Larry would provoke Brandon in, some sort of attempt to create some sort of, bond maybe. Well, it was too much for Brandon. On February 12th, 2008, at approximately 8:15 in the morning, in a class that Larry and Brandon were sharing, Brandon pulled out a .22 caliber revolver and shot Larry twice in the back of the head. Larry would die 2 days later after being taken off life support. His first trial ended in a mistrial. In 2011, he pled guilty to second-degree murder and voluntary manslaughter and got a 21-year prison sentence. This is 23-year-old Charlie Howard from Bangor, Maine. On July 7th, 1984, Charlie was leaving a potluck dinner with his boyfriend, Roy Ogden. Charlie needed to walk to the post office to retrieve some mail. While they were walking down the street, 3 teenagers, aged 15 to 17, Sean Mabry, James Francis Baines, and Daniel Ness, were driving down the road with 2 girls in their car when they spotted Charlie and Roy. The 3 pieces of shit got out of their car and started to chase the couple, screaming gay slurs at them. Charlie had asthma, so it was very hard for him to run, so he had to stop. The 3 boys caught up to him, beat the shit out of him, and began to throw him over the bridge that they would call the Chuck a Homo Bridge. Charlie begged and screamed, saying he can't swim, he has asthma. They pried his hands loose from the bar and threw him into the icy water below. While this was going on, Charlie's boyfriend Roy managed to pull a nearby fire alarm in some sort of immediate attempt to get someone to help. The 3 cowardly little bitches got in their car and then they took off. But not before they stopped to talk to Roy to say, if you tell anyone, we'll kill you. At 1 a.m., they recovered the body of Charlie. The autopsy would reveal he died due to an asthmatic attack and drowning. The 3 idiots then went to a party and started bragging about what they did. The next day, one of the boys turned themselves in when they found out he actually died. The other 2 boys ditched town. You know, like real men. When they finally returned home, they were arrested. They were tried in juvenile court, and on October 1st, 1984, they were convicted, but they were given sentences to not last past their 21st birthday. They were all released within 2 years. Now adults, all 3 men say how regretful that night was. One of them is even now an advocate for the LGBTQ. Gee, if only Charlie were alive to hear that. This was 29-year-old Rebecca Wight. She was of Iranian and Puerto Rican descent, and she was in college going towards her master's degree. Her girlfriend is 32-year-old Claudia Brenner. In May of 1988, they decided to go hiking and camping along the Appalachian Trail in Pennsylvania. On one of their first nights, they set up camp, and Rebecca went into a public restroom nearby. He is genuinely frightening to look at. She encountered Stephen Roy Carr. She was creeped out by him, so she said, hey, let's move campsites. So the couple moved to a new place. After they ate dinner, they then had sex, when Carr was watching from 80 feet away. Seeing 2 women have sex pissed Carr off so much that this creepy dude fired 8 shots into their tent. Brenner was hit 5 times, in the arms, face, head, and neck. Rebecca was shot once in the head and once through the back, which shattered her liver. Even though she was shot 5 times, Brenner was able to get up and walk 3 miles, where she eventually got to the road and someone took her to the police station. The only thing she didn't tell police was that they were a lesbian couple. When police got to the scene, they found Rebecca Wight had passed away, and Brenner survived all of her wounds. He thought they were both dead, so he left a bunch of bullets. He left a wool cap he was wearing, which police collected as evidence. He would later be turned in by a Mennonite when he was hiding out at their location. Stephen Carr waived his right to a jury trial in order to seek a deal that wouldn't get him the death penalty. He would explain he felt the women were taunting him by having sex in front of him. He was sexually abused as a child and was sexually abused while in a Florida prison. His attorney claimed that their lesbianism was what provoked him to shoot them, and he was sentenced to life in prison without parole. This was 17-year-old Nireah Johnson. On June 18, 2003, Nireah and a man named Paul Moore met each other, flirted a bit, and Nireah gave Paul an innocent kiss. A month later, on July 23rd, Nireah and her friend, Brandy Coleman, went to the home of Paul Moore. At around 12:50 a.m., the 3 of them, plus a friend, Curtis Ward, were conversating outside. A little bit later that evening, Paul Moore would ask his friend, Curtis Ward, if he knew if Nireah was male or female. Curtis wasn't sure. When Nireah went into the bathroom, Paul Moore followed, and he quickly discovered that Nireah Johnson was transgender. This immediately set Moore off, and he and his friend Curtis tied Nireah and Brandy up with wire. They then drove him to a park there in Indianapolis, when Paul took out a handgun and shot and killed Nireah and Brandy. Both men got life. Hello, true crimerers. This is the case of Kevin Bacon. No, not this Kevin Bacon. And before we go forward, viewer discretion is advised. And this is also another LGBTQ case. This was 25-year-old Kevin Bacon. On the early evening of December 24th, 2019, Kevin was meeting with a man he met off of Grindr. Just for a quick, one and done fling. It was Christmas Eve, and there was a family dinner planned that evening, and someone was going to be there that Kevin just didn't want to see. So he was just trying to find a way to get out of dinner, which is why he went on Grindr that night and found a guy to meet. So he left his apartment around 5 p.m. that evening. The next morning was obviously Christmas, and Kevin was nowhere to be found. His family and friends called him, no answer. They went out and looked for him, couldn't find him. So the day, on Christmas, they contacted police and they reported him missing. And they searched for 3 days, trying to look for Kevin anywhere. They even thought to themselves, if he's dead, he's got to be in a ditch somewhere or in the woods, just dumped somewhere. Which is obviously the result they didn't want, but they were just kind of thinking through it. And this story of Kevin Bacon became a national story. Now, police knew of a man named Mark Lutinsky. You see, prior to this event, he had the cops call on him twice for alleged kidnapping of 2 other gay men. On October 10th, 2019, 48-year-old James Carlson said he was kidnapped and he woke up in the basement of this man. He said he was at the house, he had soda, had something to eat, and the next thing he knew, he was awoken in the basement. He managed to free himself and escape the house. On November 25th, 2019, another gay man ran out of his house. He was 29 years old, said he too woke up in the basement wearing a kilt. He managed to escape the home. He called 911 as he was being chased by him. But apparently the 2 men didn't press charges against him, so the police said there was nothing they could do. So when Kevin Bacon went missing, they went to Latunsky's home. Which that just looks fucking terrifying to me. And when Latunsky opened the door, he just let police search his home. And in the basement, they found Kevin dead. He was strung up in the basement with his throat slit. And Latunsky just openly said, yeah, I did it. He said he planned to use Kevin's blood and bones for fertilization of his plants. He was going to use his muscles for jerky to eat. He even ordered a dehydrator to do this. And allegedly he did eat part of him. Oh my god. Ugh, fucking people are awful. He had actually eaten his, part of his lower parts. He was charged with murder and mutilation of a body. At first, he was found too insane to stand trial, but a year later, that was reversed. He is still awaiting trial in Shiawassee, Michigan.
Hello, true crimerers. This is another LGBTQ plus case, but it's unique in that it doesn't actually involve anyone who is confirmed to be LGBTQ plus. And this is the story of 3-year-old Ronnie Antonio Paris. Viewer discretion is advised. Ronnie was born on December 9th, 2001, and he lived with his mother and father in Tampa, Florida. In 2002, when he was only a year old, he was admitted to the hospital because he kept throwing up. He also had a broken arm. Now, doctors would determine that the vomiting was happening because he was malnourished. So the Florida Department of Child Services got involved and they removed Ronnie from the household. And then on December 13th, 2004, shortly after he turned 3 years old, he was then given back to his birth parents. One of them being Ronnie Paris Sr. This created a lot of controversy because it was rumored that Ronnie Sr. physically abused the young boy. So why on earth he was returned to him? Who knows? On January 22nd, 2005, they were over at a friend's house. That included Ronnie Sr., Ronnie Jr., and his mother, Nireah Paris. And they were at a Bible study. The 3-year-old boy, while at the house, slipped into a coma. He lay down on the couch at the friend's house, and then he just wouldn't wake up. So he was brought into the hospital. He had to go on life support, and unfortunately, 6 days later, Ronnie Jr. would die. Originally, the 2 parents were questioned together, and they swore up and down that nothing happened, he just fell into a coma. But then when Nireah was questioned on her own, she came clean. She said that Ronnie Sr. was convinced that Ronnie Jr. was gay. So he would smack and punch him in the back of the head, throw him into walls, because he didn't want his boy to grow up soft. The boy's aunt, Nireah's sister, confirmed this. She said that he would box him. A grown man would box a 3-year-old boy.
because he was afraid his boy would grow up to be a sissy. Some have even reported that it was a religiously motivated attack on the boy because he felt it was against his religion to have a gay son. Ronnie Jr. had a scarred face, he had bruises on his head. The beatings are what led to his death. The boy's mother was sentenced to 5 years probation due to child neglect. Ronnie Sr. was only given 30 years for manslaughter, for hate criming his son to death. Hello, true crimerers. Viewer discretion is advised. Let's go. This was 29-year-old Jason Gage. He lived in Waterloo, Iowa. On March 11th, 2005, Jason and some of his friends were enjoying some drinks down at some downtown Waterloo bars. In the late hours of that evening, Jason went back to his apartment, which was located in the Russell Lamson building. He did not go back to the apartment by himself. He went back to the apartment with a friend of his, 23-year-old Joseph Lawrence. Lawrence had actually just met Gage a week prior. He was introduced to Jason Gage through his girlfriend, whose name is Elizabeth Hostetler. Now at this time, Hostetler and Lawrence were expecting their first child. Jason Gage was a gay man. It's been reported by some friends that when he gets drunk, he can sometimes be a little extra flirty, and has been known to hit on straight men, which is not a crime. Now, the reason that Joseph went up to his apartment is because Joseph was waiting for a ride home, and Gage said, yeah, you can just sit in my apartment and wait for the ride there. By Monday, Jason Gage's friends and co-workers were concerned. He didn't show up to work, and they hadn't heard anything from him in days. So a wellness check was done by the police, and at 11 p.m. on March 14th, 2005, Jason Gage's body was found bludgeoned to death. He was also stabbed in the neck, and there was still a piece of glass sticking out of his neck. Now, the friend that was supposed to be picking up Joseph Lawrence on the night that Gage and him were together in the apartment said Joseph never showed up for the ride. Police also checked his text messages, and he had actually sent texts to his friends in Iowa and in New Mexico, where he was from, texts that would state, "I think I just killed a guy." In a phone call with one of his friends, Joseph would say that some guy tried to hit on me real bad, and then said a fight happened that got way out of hand. Joseph had also told his girlfriend Elizabeth that he beat up Gage. Some people think that maybe he didn't know he actually killed him. Unlikely. So the 23-year-old was arrested the day they discovered the body. He would then confess that he got in a fight with Gage, hit him with a bottle, and then stabbed him in the neck with a piece of glass. Elizabeth Hostetler would say that this wasn't a hate crime, but Gage made advances towards my boyfriend, and that's what sparked the attack. Yeah, hun, that's a hate crime. But he wasn't charged with the hate crime. He ended up taking an Alford plea and sentenced to 50 years. Sakia Gunn was born on May 26, 1987, and she lived her life in Newark, New Jersey. In 2003, she was 15 years old and a lesbian. On the night of May 11th, 2003, Sakia was out with some of her friends, just hanging out in Greenwich Village, Manhattan. They were awaiting the New Jersey Transit bus when Sakia and her friends were being catcalled and, flirted with by two other African-American men. One of them being Richard McCullough. Richard and his friend began accosting the girls and was trying to proposition them into some sort of, sexual interaction. So 15-year-old Sakia took the lead, and she said, "No thank you, we're lesbians." And this is when Richard McCullough and his friend attacked them. And Sakia, she fought right back. But unfortunately, he had a knife on him and he stabbed Sakia in the chest. And then, like real brave men, they got into a car and fled. Sakia's friends managed to flag a car down and they got Sakia to the hospital, but she did not survive. McCullough actually turned himself in a few days later, and he was given a plea bargain. The murder charges were dropped, and on March 3rd, 2005, he would eventually plead guilty to aggravated manslaughter and aggravated assault and bias intimidation. This was labeled a hate crime. This asshole had the nerve to say that Sakia died after running into his knife. Unbefucking-leavable. Fuck whoever gave him manslaughter charges, because he was only sentenced to 20 years in prison. If you murder a person, you should never be able to walk free on the streets again. But hey, that's just me. Because of Sakia's death, the community, banded together, and they were able to establish a gay and lesbian youth center. It also helped create an LGBTQ advisory council to the mayor, and the Newark Pride Alliance was established in the wake of Sakia's murder. It's tragic that people like Sakia have to die for these types of things to happen, for this to be recognized, for people to do something about it. You should never have to be afraid of being who you are and being able to say who you are. You shouldn't have to have the fear of death in order to say those things out loud. My name is Mike, and I am a proud gay man, but I am sorry that Sakia couldn't say the same thing and live. Today's case? What is that? Is he still there? Oh, he's still there. Oh, this science experiment gone wrong is Stephen Port. He's also been dubbed as the, Grindr serial killer. Ugh. Can you put like a paper bag over your head? Or... Stephen Port was born on February 22nd. Sorry, let me do an England way. He was born on 22nd February 1975 in Southend-on-Sea, Essex, United Kingdom. Growing up, Stephen would be considered a loner. Teachers and family members would describe him as being super quiet and shy. Even as an adult, like his friends and neighbors would say he has an almost childlike temperament. He played with toys still. He would come out as being gay when he was in his mid-20s. Around that same time, Stephen was working as a chef at Stagecoach Bus Depot in West Ham. If you are a fan of Master Chef, Stephen had a very brief background cameo in one of the episodes. See that right there, sir? Hi, sir. You probably should have had him arrested just by looking at you like that. You're not listening. Okay. Sir, where's my salad? Chicken Caesar? 1-star Google review. All right, let's get serious, folks. On 17 June 2014, 23-year-old Anthony Walgate was contacted by Stephen Port, and Anthony sometimes worked as an escort, so Stephen pretended to be a client and offered him £800 for his service. They would meet at Barking Station. On 19 June 2014, Stephen Port would call 999. He did it anonymously, saying that a young boy had collapsed and had a seizure and died. He was referring to Anthony. Police missed the evidence connecting Stephen to his death, but Stephen would be convicted of perverting the course of justice because he lied to police. He was sentenced to 8 months in jail. In August and September of 2015, Stephen would meet and murder 22-year-old Gabriel Kovari, who was originally from Slovakia, 21-year-old chef Daniel Whitworth, and 25-year-old forklift truck driver Jack Taylor. He would meet them through gay dating apps like Grindr, I don't think you can say that on here, by dolling himself up with wigs to, what he says, make himself look more attractive. He would get them to his flat, serve them wine spiked with gamma hydroxybutyric acid, GHB. He would then sexually assault them, and he administered all 4 men with lethal levels of GHB mixed with poppers, Viagra, meth. With the exception of his first victim, the other 3 he dumped in a nearby graveyard with fake suicide notes on them. He even tried to blame one of them for the other murders. He was caught, and he was sentenced to life. And today we're going to cover Brandon Teena, a name you might be familiar with. Brandon was born on December 12, 1972 in Lincoln, Nebraska. He never got to know his father because unfortunately his dad passed away in a car accident months before he was even born. Now, Brandon was born biologically a female, and his mother named him Teena Marie. Brandon had a sister named Tammy, and unfortunately both of them would be sexually abused by their uncle throughout their adolescence. Pretty early on in Brandon's childhood, he would begin to identify as a male. He even dated a boy under this pretense. His mother did not really like the idea of him referring to himself as a male, and so she rejected that whole notion. And she continued to refer to Brandon as a female. In 1992, Brandon would go under psychiatric treatment for having a sexual identity crisis. In 1993, Brandon moved to Falls City, Nebraska. He made a few friends and would move into the house of a woman named Lisa Lambert. He would then begin dating a friend of Lambert's named Lana Tisdale. And this is when he also began associating with John Lauder and Tom Neeson. Yeah, those faces about sum up their lives. In 1993, Brandon Teena would go to jail for forging checks. Brandon was put into the female section of the jail, which is when Tisdale learned that he was actually a female. Brandon told her, "I'm pursuing a sex change operation," and they continued dating. On Christmas Eve 1993, these two piece of shit gentlemen, Lauder and Neeson, forced Brandon Teena to remove his pants and show that he actually had female parts. They would then sexually assault him repeatedly. At some point that evening, Brandon managed to escape. At 1 a.m. on December 31st, 1993, Lauder and Neeson broke into Lisa Lambert's house where Brandon was living, found Lambert in bed, and forced her to tell them where Brandon was. Brandon was under the bed. They asked if anyone else was in the house, and there was, a man named Philip Devine. These two then shot Devine, Lambert, and then Brandon Teena, all in front of Lambert's baby. Neeson would say later on in court that he noticed Brandon was still twitching, so he took a knife and stabbed him in the chest until he was dead. These two psychopaths were adamant about revealing what Brandon Teena was hiding, that he was a female, that he was transgender, because to them it was gross. And yet they have hair like that. But on a serious note, fuck them both. Neeson was convicted of murder and sentenced to life in prison. Lauder was sentenced to death. Brandon's story was told in a film called Boys Don't Cry. Hilary Swank played Brandon, and she won an Oscar for it. Chloe Sevigny played Tisdale, and she was nominated for an Oscar. How many more people need to die for being perceived as different? Ali Forney was born on April 12, 1975 in Charlotte, North Carolina. But he would end up being raised in Brooklyn, New York. Ali was gay and transgender, and occasionally went by the name Luscious. Love it. When he was only 13 years old, Ali would become involved in sex work. He felt rejected by his family, and then eventually he just joined a group home. He was in and out of foster homes, but he said that living on the streets is where he felt most comfortable. He was seen on the streets dressed in women's clothing, and he looked happy as can be. After he cleaned himself up, he became a counselor and an advocate for homeless LGBTQ youth. At 4 a.m. on December 5th, 1997, Ali was found shot to death in front of a housing project in Harlem. He was the third transgender youth that was murdered in a 14-month span. In 2002, this was made in his honor. And this is kind of a strange one because not a whole lot is known about it. This was 19-year-old Steen Fenrich, and he was a gay man. Steen actually joined the army in 1997, but then he was discharged after just 9 months. By 1999, he was living with his partner in Queens, New York. Steen did have a bit of a risque lifestyle as he was known to pose for professional pornographic images. From what I can see, he had a pretty decent relationship with his mother, but he had a very bad relationship with his stepfather, John. John did not at all approve of Steen's homosexual lifestyle, and he was actually glad when Steen moved out of the house. Well, on September 9th, 1999, Steen had basically announced that him and his partner were breaking up and that he was going to request to move back in with his mother and with his stepfather, John. John apparently didn't like this, and he was extremely upset that he was even asking. Then Steen allegedly left the home and was never seen again. That is until March 21st, 2000. A man walking through the Alley Pond Park in the Bayside area of Queens, New York, found a tub with human remains in it. There was a human skull that had been burned by acid, according to authorities. There was a foot with some flesh still on it, and then just various other body parts, but it was a dismembered corpse in this small tub. Even more disturbing, written on the skull in permanent marker was the social security number of Steen Fenrich. There was also racial and homophobic slurs written on the skull. The police immediately phoned John Fenrich, Steen's stepfather, and they told him they found the remains of Steen, but that's all. They didn't give him any specifics. John then immediately calls News 12 Long Island. He told them that his son's dismembered body was found and that he was killed because he was gay. Well, police heard this, and immediately a red flag went up. The police never told John that his body was dismembered, and they never told John what was written on his skull. Police would also find out that John called Steen's partner to tell him that Steen was going away for a few days. On March 22nd, 2000, John bolted from an interview he was doing with a news station, climbed the roof of the building he lived in, began shooting guns off from the roof, but not actually aiming at anyone, or he didn't hit anyone either. He was screaming for the police to shoot him, and he said, "I'm a failure as a father." They had a back and forth standoff for 8 hours. And then John Fenrich put a gun to his head and took his own life. And police would announce that they are pretty certain that John Fenrich murdered his gay son because he asked to move back in and because he didn't agree with his lifestyle.